Well, all right. I think we can go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Krajniak, and I'm the executive editor of Consequence Forum, which is a nonprofit literary organization concerned with addressing the human consequences and realities of war and geopolitical violence. Tonight, in conjunction with Hen Press, four exceptional authors from the new anthology, New Moons Contemporary Writing by North American Muslims, will read select passages of their work and engage in a roundtable discussion about, among many, many other things, the staggering and ongoing acts of violence throughout the world that many Muslim communities have and continue to experience. So without further ado, let me please introduce tonight's authors. First, we have Kazim Ali, the editor of the anthology. He was born in the UK and has lived transnationally in the US, Canada, India, France, and the Middle East. His books encompass multiple genres, including the volumes of poetry Inquisition, Skyward, which was the winner of the Ohioana Book Award in poetry, The Far Mosque, which was winner of the Alice James Books New England, New York Award, The 40th Day, All One's Blue, and the cross-genre text Bright Felon and Wind Instrument. His novels include the recently published The Secret Room, a string quartet, and among his books of essays are the hybrid memoir Silver Road, Essays, Maps, and Calligraphies, and Fasting for Ramadan, Notes from a Spiritual Practice. He is also an accomplished translator and an editor of several anthology and books of criticism. After a career in public policy and organizing, Ali taught at various colleges and universities, including Oberlin, Davidson College, St. Mary's College, California, and Naropa. He is currently a professor of literature at the University of California, San Diego, and his newest books are a volume of 3 long poems entitled The Voice of Sheila Chandra and a memoir of his Canadian childhood, Northern Light. Next is Ayeh Bandeh-Ahmadi, whose forthcoming memoir and stories, Ayeh, was a finalist for the First Pages Prize and Chautauqua Foundation's Janus Prize, recognizing an emerging writer's work for daring innovations that reorder literary conventions and readers' imaginations. Her writing has appeared in Entropy Magazine's Top 25, No Tokens, and Pank, and has been recognized with support from Military Arts, the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation's Creative Fellowship, and the Breadloaf Catherine Bakeless Nason Scholarship. She was part of a 10-person team responsible for raising $4 trillion to support COVID stimulus at the U.S. Department of Treasury and has taught personal essay writing to Washington, D.C. high school students for Penn Faulkner. Next is Sham-e-Ali Nayeem, who is an Indian Muslim American poet, interdisciplinary artist, and recovering public interest lawyer. She is author of the poetry collection City of Pearls and an album by the same name. In addition to poetry and visual art, Nayeem releases her poetry in the form of music and is currently working on her second album of electronic poetic expression. She is the recipient of the 2016 Loft Literary Center Spoken Word Immersion Fellowship. And finally, we have Duaa Randhawa. Duaa is a writer born and raised in Queens and currently based in D.C. She works in international development, more specifically diaspora development with issues of migration and refugees. Her writing is a combination of creative nonfiction and prose poetry, which meets at the juncture of experience, identity, and community. This poem is part of a larger collection titled Bouts. Bouts is an exploration of self, identity, and history, and all the nuances and confusions that come along with such an exploration. I'd like to welcome all the authors, and I believe now Kazim will talk a little bit about the anthology.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to be with you today, and I'm so glad to be here with these incredible writers whose work we're featuring in the anthology. This anthology is not the first anthology of Muslim writing. but it is hopefully, I think personally, the broadest, and incorporates writings from across the aesthetic spectrum and across the range of experiences of what it means to be Muslim. So I just want to read to you like 2 or 3 short excerpts from the introduction to the anthology, and that will be my way of introducing to you some of the reasons why the anthology came to be and how it came to be. So at the outset, I want to suggest that the project of this anthology may run counter to the most common purposes of such an anthology, which would normally be to suggest an arc or trajectory or range of common interests of Muslim writers. But it's hard to say what a Muslim is. There are, of course, a multiplicity of Islams, a range of perspectives and schools of thought about the ways to practice, what the religion means, and how to access the divine. This plurality is historical. Nearly immediately upon its founding, there were already multiple streams of Islam's lineages that continued in the first generation of Islam's founding to diverge. And as Islam spread within 2 centuries following the Prophet's death across the Maghreb and into Spain and France to the north, into the rest of Africa to the south, and along the Silk Roads into China in the east, and eventually to South Asia and Oceania and the Americas via the slave trade, Islam continued to develop, change, and grow, and to influence and be influenced by the cultures it encountered. This plurality is neither modern, postmodern, or contemporary. It has been part and parcel of Islam since the moment of its founding. I wanted to put together this archive precisely because I wanted to shape a new definition of Muslim and of Islam. And maybe it is strange for someone like me, someone who has a complicated relationship to the tradition and struggles with the expectations of what it means to be Muslim in the first place, to be editing an anthology of contemporary writing by North American Muslims. On the other hand, maybe my complex relationship to the tradition is precisely the reason why I can. Muslim writing in North America is older than anyone supposes, of course. Most, if not all, of the first Western Africans who lived here, brought as enslaved labor, were practicing Muslims and had been for hundreds of years before their capture. The Islam they practiced was generational, sophisticated, and infused with a deeply African spiritual and philosophical framework. And to my mind, the theology of liberation that drove Southern Black Christianity as it was practiced among enslaved African populations from their arrival through the civil rights movement and to the present day has its roots in the deeply foundational liberation theology of original Islam. And of course, there's been a lot of scholarship done that you can easily find about the relationship between Middle Eastern music and the Islamic call to prayer, and the labor songs of the enslaved African people through to the blues and Black American music. There's a through line. At its heart, Islam is cosmopolitan, multicultural, multilingual, anti-capitalist, that is true, feminist, friendly to alternative family and community structures, and radical in its approach to questions of religion, religious and political authority. So radical, in fact, that within years of the passing of the Prophet and the original generation of teachers, what Muslims call his companions, the ruling classes of the era had fully co-opted the teachings, eliminated the democratic oral transmission of scripture by canonizing a written version of the Quran and destroying all variants. That happened. And marginalized or murdered most of the teachers who taught alternative doctrines. And then doctrines alternative to that which was approved by the political elite. It was not until the ascendance hundreds of years later of the more socially liberal Western Caliphate in Al-Andalus that Islam began to once more resemble the Islam of its earliest days. This is all historical stuff. We have slightly different views on it, but this is more or less what happened. Islam is a system of belief like poetry itself. It incorporates doubt and questioning into its fiber, because even though one can be considered Muslim by birth, one still has to recite the Shahada to embrace Islam and declare oneself a believer. And in fact, in Twelver Shiaism, this choice is codified further, since each Shia person is required to select a contemporary scholar to be their own spiritual leader. And it's not uncommon for different people in the same household to have different spiritual leaders. That was true in the house that I grew up in. One significant verse of the Quran appears near its beginning. This is the book, period. In it, there is no doubt, period. Growing up under the shadow of such an authoritarian dictum, I continually wondered at my own doubts, engagements with faith, forays away through and within dogmatic teachings. Now, of course, if you study Arabic, and many of the people on this call you probably have done, you will know that punctuation in Arabic does not work the same way that punctuation does in English. There are many different kinds of periods, for example. There are periods which are like, or you can go on, and there are periods which are like, this is the end. And they have these little symbols above them to tell you which is which. In other words, there are no commas in periods. There are different types of clause endings. And this particular verse of the Quran, which is the opening of Surah Al-Baqarah, you can go and look at it after the call if you want to see what I'm talking about. Those are the things that were translated as full stop periods are not in the Arabic. And so in a new translation by a translator named Muhammad Sarwar, he, rather than this is the book, period, in it there is no doubt, period, he translates this verse as, there is no doubt this book is a guide for the pious. Now, hold the door. Those are two very different things. The latter means, the first means this is a set of rules that someone else is going to decide exactly what it means, and you are going to have to follow it. And the second means this book is intended as an engagement. It is intended as a guide. It is intended for you to engage with it. And continuously throughout the Quran, of course, is that those of you who've read the Quran, you're going to know, you're going to recognize this verse. Scattered throughout the chapters of this epic book is a sort of refrain that appears over and over again. And it's a line that says, here is a sign for those who would reflect. Or this is a sign for those who would think. Something like that, I can't remember the Arabic line itself, but it's continuously reminding you, please think, please engage, please try to understand, please discuss. If we think about the Judeo-Christian tradition, as it's called, Judeo-Christian tradition, which leaves out the later Islam, those of us who study religions really know the tradition is a Judeo-Islamic tradition. And these traditions are very much closer to each other. And the Christian tradition sort of deviated off of that in many different ways, also in part because it was co-opted by the European power structures. But that tradition of argument and discourse that is famous in Jewish tradition in the form of the Talmud and the arguments that range across millennia practically between the rabbis who discuss it, we have this in the Quran as well, or this is what it was intended for. In such a fundamentally decentralized religion, scripture does remain the province of poetry, an art made for doubting and the doubtful to create structures of meaning, to privilege and plumb the notions of bewilderment, doubt, and interrogative spirituality. And I use poetry here as a metaphor, but I think all types of creative writing. So this book has poetry in it, it has fiction, it has memoir, it has reflection. There's even a little bit of a kind of journalistic type of essay. There's a little fragment of an essay on a character from the Miss Marvel comic book in it. What makes an anthology like this interesting are precisely the reasons that it would seem to be on the surface irrelevant. Each of the writers contained in this anthology brings their own relationship with Islam to the page, and it's not always apparent from writer to writer how they're positioning themselves within the larger context of Islam. It includes the religious of all stripes, practicing and non-practicing, the cultural Muslim, the secular Muslim, the feminist Muslim, Muslims of various gender identities, sexual orientations, and national origins. The writers within are converts, reverts, good Muslims, bad Muslims, born Muslim, ex-Muslim, trying to be Muslim, failing to be Muslim. And we've structured the anthology in alphabetical order in order to allow each writer to be experienced on their own. I wanted to represent the full range of contemporary expressions of Islam, as well as a full range of genres. The Muslim community is plural and contradictory, and this collection of voices ought to be symphony and cacophony at once, like the body of Muslims as they are today. So I'm so excited to hear these wonderful readers share with you and have our conversation later as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll kick off the readings. I just want to say thank you, first of all, to Ayeh, Kazim, Matthew, and the whole team that made this possible. I'm very grateful to be included in this anthology with incredible writers, some of whom I've been following for a long time myself, and to be reading today. Like Matthew already introduced, the piece I'm reading is from a collection I wrote in 2017. The collection is called Bouts. And this is an untitled piece from it. On some days, I look the name of my grandfather's brother up on YouTube. The first result reads, Afzal Ehsan Randhawa, Nawa Galugara, New Holocaust. The video is an interview conducted in 2014 about a poem he wrote in 1984 when the Indian government attacked Sri Darbar Sahib, the holiest Gurdwara in Sikhism. My grandfather's brother says to the interviewer in thick and fluent Punjabi, the split of Punjab was the split of my heart, and the attack on Darbar Sahib was an attack on my body. The interviewer asks him to recite the poem, and my grandfather's brother begins. I struggle to keep up with the majesty of a language I'm only slightly familiar with, one that I hear only when my mother is mad and when my parents fight. People show their true nature when they're mad, my mother says. Her true nature is Punjabi. One that I hear only in interactions between elders in the village and when those elders, too old and too rooted in their history to bother learning Urdu, speak to me. Even 30 years after he's written the poem, my grandfather's brother's voice cracks when he recites it. He cries, and some days like today, I cry with him. I don't understand his loss or why the words of a man who prays in a masjid hold such agony over the loss of a Sikh temple. I cry because I cannot grasp my mother tongue. I cry because the words I understand knock the breath out of me with their density, their rhythm, their capacity. I cry because I cannot translate these words here on this page because so much meaning would be lost in between. I cry because his voice sounds so much like my grandfather's, and this is the closest I've been to him in so long. My mother tells me that when the British left India, they divided up all the provinces geographically, so that when the partition happened, India and Pakistan would forever be at war. I cry for the partition that split Punjab in two and for the elders that had to give up their tongues and adopt the language of a new land. No, the land was the same. It was the nation that was new. My grandfather's brother doesn't cry for someone else's temple. He cries for the genocide of his brothers, the people that were his home, or at least they stood for his home before they too were ripped in two. Mera charda suraj dubya, mere din nu kha gayi raat. My rising sun set, my day consumed by night. Thank you.
Dua, thank you so much. That was really powerful. Thank you. Kazim, thank you also for that wonderful introduction, and just a real honor to be a part of this anthology. Thank you to everyone that organized tonight's event, Ayeh, and everyone at Consequence Forum. I'm going to read a piece that's in the book titled Partition Story, that is also was originally published in my book, City of Pearls. Partition Story. 1. My father left this world, and with him some of his story. I have small bits, but not the whole. This is the story where we have returned to Hyderabad together, back to the graves of my grandparents, back to the things that are no longer there. Maybe he would tell me how much has changed. Maybe he would tell me what was here once, the path he walked to school, the places he loved the most. This was the story I was waiting for. 2. I cling to glimpses of things shared quickly over kitchen tables. Somber sits in silver bowls like constellations as he mentions long walks by the cattails, photographs of reflections in the water, the places he worked, his love of learning, a determination to save lives. But I never got the full story. It would sit there on the edge of his lips like a small cloud. Maybe he left that story on the Deccan Plateau. Maybe he wasn't looking back. Or maybe I never asked. 3. In a frame is a picture of a small boy, not smiling, post-partition India, standing straight with a heavy bag of books across his young shoulder like a shield. He's holding in a story, rain within clouds. He kept that story somewhere tucked in suitcases and train windows, buses, car rides, planes, over oceans, over continents. Kept it. 4. This is the story that you will lose if you do not ask. Thank you.
Wow, Sham-e-Ali. I think I've read that poem in this anthology, I don't know, maybe like 4 or 5 times, and I just get chills listening to you read it. It's so beautiful. So I read my galley of the anthology, which is like, kind of here in the not book form, even though the book just came out into the world yesterday, over 2 months this summer. And I basically read like about a couple pieces a day or like one piece or so a day. And it was just such great sunshine to be with these pieces during some really dark weeks in our world and, just in life. And I'm so excited that this is out there in the world, partly because it's a book that I would have loved to have growing up, but also I think it's a book that, like, so many of us that, we have different versions of what it means to be Muslim or a North American writer. And Kazim talks about good Muslims, bad Muslims, converts, reverts, trying to be, failing to be Muslim that are in this book. But I feel like, this is a set of a collection of writing that is representative of maybe not every Muslim in North America, but a broad set. And it's something that, like, I feel like so many different people I know with so many different perspectives can kind of hang on to and maybe feel like they see themselves in there. And it's so rare to see writing that does that. And it gives me hope that, there's a place for me and my family and the people I've grown up with who are Muslim or aren't Muslim that can kind of like come together and read each other and understand each other. And so that's why I'm so excited for this anthology. I'm so honored to get to be here today. And I'm so grateful to these writers for being here with us and for Kazim for pulling us together. And that's also why I'm really excited to be here with Consequence. So here's an issue of Consequence, I think from back in 2017. That was the first one I was introduced to. And I just really love this organization's long-term commitment to making sure that there's a space where different voices and readers can come together that we don't always see, getting to read each other and hear each other's stories. And I think, because this is a collection of writing by North American Muslims, when we were talking with Matthew about what writers would kind of be a good fit for Consequence, of course, became clear that, like, even though there's so many different places where there's violence happening around the world, Muslims are a major part of, experiencing a lot of these things around the world, that in North America, a lot of us, we feel more distant, or we've not been there in those places on those front lines. And so many of our stories, for those of us that haven't, been traveling back and forth, which I think is most of us in the anthology, or just at least that's what the writing reflects. Our stories are kind of these intergenerational stories of violence and how it's affected us. And so for me, my family came from Iran in 1976. They came to get their graduate degrees and they were planning to go back. And so I was supposed to move back to Iran. And it was because of a lot of intergenerational legacies of violence and war and things that were happening. Um, the revolution in Iran happened in 1979. That ultimately I stayed here. And, until last year, I was working in Treasury and found myself involved in American history in a whole different way. So the piece I'm going to read you is called Homany, and it is the first story in my memoir of as stories. And um, the one thing I want to say about it is that it's a story that's told in fragments, and I write about myself in the third person here because it's kind of my way of pulling together the different identities and pieces of stories that other people have told about me, and to kind of highlight the tensions that exist when you're trying to make and pull together a story for yourself and have it be kind of a firm story you can hang on to in the face of a lot of things, but different people tell different stories about you. So here we go. It happened after the song circle, when all the kids and teachers sat around the dark purple carpet to sing together. Sometimes they would do the hokey pokey, which I was good at, or the hand motions to the wheels on the bus and Itsy Bitsy Spider. This time, everyone began to sway as they sang, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Afterward, Teacher Fran took Ayeh aside. "I saw you dancing," Teacher Fran said sternly. "Your parents said you're not allowed to dance." "But I wasn't dancing," Ayeh said. It was mostly true. She couldn't remember dancing to any songs. "I saw you swaying. Your parents said you're allowed to sing and make hand motions, but not lose yourself to the music." If Ayeh thought about it hard, there might have been some swaying, but she hadn't done it on purpose, and she had never heard her parents share their rules about dancing with Teacher Fran. Teachers never punish kids for something other kids were told to do. What else had her parents told Teacher Fran? "You can't do that again, okay?" said the teacher. Would Teacher Fran tell her parents? Even as the days and weeks passed without another mention of the incident, Ayeh wondered. This morning, Aya's dad buckled her into the child seat on his bike. He pedaled to the community center where he dropped her off for school, then off to his class in another part of the university. Now one of the big kids, Aya's comfortable here. She pays better attention to what she's supposed to do. She has a better idea of what Teacher Fran might know. Class time ends for the day. The children play outside. One by one, they leave with their parents. Aya's dad's nowhere to be seen. Did he forget? Did something bad happen? "Do you know who's supposed to pick you up today?" Teacher Fran asks Ayeh. "I don't know. Usually my dad comes." "Did he or your mom say anything to you? Do you know where he might be?" "No." Ayeh shakes her head. "Come on," says Teacher Fran. "I'll take you home. Do you know where you live?" Aya knows the way home, but she also knows that her parents don't like unannounced visitors. In the living room at home, sitting on the bookcase, are some framed verses from the Quran that Aya can't read yet, and a photo of a man named Imam Khomeini that Aya's parents turn face down whenever the university firemen or water repairmen come. Without anyone knowing to expect Teacher Fran, those picture frames will be in plain view. But what can she do? Teacher Fran seems anxious to leave. It had been a long time since her last classmate was picked up. "Yes, I know the way," she says. Teacher Fran takes Aya's hand and they set off to the other end of Solana Park. As they walk through the garden-style apartment buildings of the graduate housing community, Ayah considers what to do. She doesn't know how to read a clock yet, but she remembers her dad saying it takes 10 minutes to walk from their apartment to the far playground near the community center. Every night, Aya's parents watch the news to follow what's happening in Iran. For 4 years now, an ugly man in Iraq named Saddam Hussein has been bombing homes there and hurting and killing people. Unlike Saddam, whose dark eyebrows and mustache bend angrily downward, the man in the photo on Aya's living room wall looks kind and thoughtful. He has a long white beard, the color of snow, and a gentle smile. He wears a soft, round black hat he earned from studying for a long time. Her parents explained that he helped a lot of people in Iran. He stood up to Saddam, but in America, most people don't know about those he helped, so they think he's bad. If they see the picture, they might think Aya's family is bad too. Aya considers what teacher Fran will expect once they arrive. Can she tell the teacher to wait downstairs while she looks for her parents? Will teacher want to be invited inside? Surely she'll want to know Aya's safely at home with a parent. She'll want an explanation. But if Aya's mom looks through the peephole in the apartment door and sees Aya instead of teacher Fran, she might think her daughter walked home on her own or that she's with her dad. Inside the apartment, there's a beautiful black, red, and Persian and gray Persian carpet, the perfect size for Aya to play on. Her mom says this is Aya's very own carpet. If teacher Fran takes a single step inside from the door, she'll be standing on the carpet. From there, if she turns to look around or even to leave, she'll see the picture frames. What would happen then? Would her family be in trouble? Teacher Fran still holds Aya's hand as they walk along the asphalt path. When they reach the playground she usually plays in, Aya knows she doesn't have much time left. If she tells teacher Fran to wait downstairs, she could face more questions. Going to a friend's home instead would lead to more questions too. But if her parents were at home, they couldn't possibly know to expect teacher Fran. Teachers never took children home. We live here, Aya says. Oh, good. Teacher Fran sounds relieved. Which apartment are you in? They hold hands as they walk up the stairs. As they come to the landing, Aya lets go. She runs to the apartment door and knocks loudly. Mommy, Daddy, she shouts in English. Are you home? Teacher Fran brought me. She tries to use all the energy she can. There's some rustling inside. Then the door opens. Aya's mom wears a dark blue headscarf tied around her neck. She has on a green blouse with pink flowers that's one of her daughter's favorites, and a long blue skirt. It's good to see you, she greets them both. Where's Daddy? He was supposed to pick you up from school. Then she turns to teacher Fran. Hossein didn't come? Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Thank you for bringing Aya home. The two women exchange greetings as they talk. Aya's mom reaches for the telephone to dial Aya's dad's office at the university. Aya steps inside onto her Persian carpet. The picture frames are gone. So I'm going to lead our conversation from here. And the first question I want to ask, because I think something that really has a reverberation across all of the pieces we read is this concept of home and what that means to different people within a story. And so I actually want to start by asking Kazim first if the concept of home, because the concept of home is something that echoes through a lot of your writing. So I want to ask just, was that on your mind when, or was there a concept of home that you had in mind when you set out in editing this anthology?
I think of home a lot as it pertains to, I mean, in my own life as a nomad, at least for the first 10 years of my life, living in 4 different places, and then continuing in my adult life to, have never really settled down. I lived for 12 years in Ohio. That's the longest I've lived anywhere. But I don't necessarily even feel home there. And I think there is something deeply rooted in the culture. It was a nomadic culture in the beginning in terms of not an agricultural society, and the concept of the pilgrimage that is based into the in the religion. Of course, we're all required to once in our lives make this journey around the world. And then I come to this also the image of the prayer rug that recurs. For me is like the prayer rug as home. It's a portable home that it gets packed up and rolled up and carried with you. And if you're Shia, I don't know what everyone is here, but Shia people put our foreheads on a piece of clay when we pray, so that little tablet of clay, I have one right here. This little tablet of clay, it's from Karbala in Iraq. Although now I think, they probably make them from anywhere, but this one is from Iraq, certainly. And that idea that you're kind of carrying it with you a little bit. It's like that poem by Naomi Shihab Nye, the famous one about the airport terminal, where the Palestinian grandmother has a plant in her suitcase because it's like this folk tale that you keep a living thing with you to keep you grounded. And of course, if think about Palestinian people or many Muslim people who are displaced or who don't have homes, or people in Pakistan or the Rohingya people in Burma, where the borders crossed them. Type of situation, and then you no longer have a place. I feel like that's just a condition, somehow a painful condition of life as a Muslim. The slave trade, which was among the many things it was this huge displacement of a Muslim population from one place in the world to another place in the world, and a loss of their spiritual heritage as well, in terms of them being sort of, we talk about the forcible conversion that happened in Spain. We don't often talk about the forcible conversion that happened in the American South, with all of these Muslim people arriving on American shores and then sort of being forced to worship in a different tradition, to become Christian in order to survive, basically. I don't know if there's scholarship on that, but it haunts me, certainly. So I feel like we're all sort of, we've got these questions of home and displacement coded into our DNA. And then lo and behold, it's probably something poets knew instinctually for a long time. But the scientists who in the past year, the scientists who are doing research on trauma, people with trauma in their families, saying that trauma can code itself in the DNA. So if you have like a grandparent who was like violently assaulted or some terrible thing happened, that it can code in the DNA and manifest itself over generations, that trauma. So what we sort of knew a little bit by our instinct turns out to be, scientifically provable. So maybe there's a reason we're all haunted by this, wanting a home, wanting to make a home, wanting to be accepted, by a society that, half of them really hates us.
Sham-e-Ali or Dua, do you want to add anything about how you were thinking about home from different perspectives while you were writing this? And/or I think the next question I want to ask you guys about both is just your process of research and memory, what role those play in writing, especially about these, historical legacies, as well as your own memories that you're drawing from. So you can answer any of that.
I'm gonna answer on the home topic. For me, I find home in my relationships, and that's what is home for me. With my father, with my son, with my mom, and then over these years, really developing a sense of home. People say home is within yourself, but really embodying oneself to fully and truly believe and maintain and be in a practice of maintaining the home that is within ourself and in this body that we are given, that our spirit lives in, that ultimately connects us to God, to Allah. And so the ultimate home is returning to Allah, for me at least. So just wanted to tag along with Kazim's beautiful answer.
Yeah, I can add to that. For me, I think the concept of home is something that I have to think a lot about in my writing, but also my professional work. A lot of the research and work that I have done and I hope to do is around issues of migration and refugees, and so displacement, like Kazim was talking about. And as a result of it, the transnational sense of home and community migrants are forced to have, and then how that understanding of home and community is passed down to the next generation that's born and raised in the diaspora, even though we haven't migrated ourselves. In my writing, I think a lot about my mother's migration and the loneliness that an entire generation of our immigrant mothers must carry, having left their homes, and then most of them following their husbands to an entirely new land. I found a letter that my mom's youngest brother wrote to her once a few years after she moved to New York. And the last line in it says, would that I could spend my life near you. Anyway, I miss you so much. And that really made me pause and think that we can never understand uprooting in the way that our mothers do. Neither can we understand violence in the way that people that experienced partition and our elders did. But the violence of those generations before us, it affected their homes directly in the sense of partition, and then it affected our understandings of home for generations to come. But it's also a means of us connecting to our elders and understanding them in a way that isn't directly available to us because those senses existed before we were even a part of their lives.
So true. I think that those are themes that echo across this whole anthology. It's pretty evident what you talk about with parents' trauma, mothers' traumas, and just, you know, generational issues of that. So I wonder if both of you, well, Kazim, your writing obviously has so much research and translation and things to draw on, and we've heard about that from the introduction. But Sham-e-Ali and Dua, both of you, your writing is also really deeply researched from either, like, you know, there's like family history, or like you were talking about, just kind of migration studies and that sort of thing. All of this is layered together with memory, or at least, like, as a reader, that's kind of the experience of being with one of these poems. So I wonder if you can talk about what role memory and research play for you, and just kind of if what the process was for you in bringing that into these pieces.
Sure. I think this is another aspect of being a diaspora kid. I think across the board, we really have a sense of wanting to connect with our history and our culture deeply, even more so maybe because it isn't as directly accessible to us as it was to our parent generation, because we're born in a different culture, in a different place. And so we have to contend with that stuff differently. I think my desire to be connected to my history and my culture comes even more from a sense of wanting to feel close to my grandfather, especially after his death. One of my biggest regrets, honestly, is not recording an oral history of his when he was alive. And when he passed in 2016, I had just turned 19. And I think that was when I really realized, like, the gravity of the history that was lost with him as well. I'm very fortunate that my mother, who's my grandfather was her father-in-law, but she was very close to him, and she seems to know more of his stories than his children usually do. But in this piece in particular is me relying on other people's memories of my grandfather's brothers and my mother's to feel this closeness to my grandfather. But I really love writing that you can see is well-researched and is very historical. Another example that I would like to give that I really love is when I was in grad school a few years ago. I was getting a degree in international development, and I was reading City of Spies by Soraya Khan, which takes place in 1970s Pakistan. And it's a historical novel, very well researched. And there's one scene in it where she describes the main character's parents at an event where there's Americans and many foreign dignitaries. And she says something along the lines of, it was the only place in Pakistan where alcohol was allowed to be served. And that it reminded me of something my father used to say about my grandfather, that he worked with Americans all his life and he never drank or smoked. And so that made me call my mom right away. And so all I knew about my grandfather's job at that point was that he had worked with Americans, and that was how my parents were able to migrate. But for my entire life, my grandfather was retired. So I called my mom and I asked, who exactly did he work for? And she said USAID. And I was like, do you know what USAID stands for? And she was like, what? I said, United States Agency of International Development. So I had no idea that I was following in my grandfather's path. And it was such an affirmation for me. And maybe I wouldn't have found out if it wasn't for Soraya Khan and her research and memory. So it's something I hold dear and I really love.
That's beautiful.
That's so beautiful, Dua. I love stories like that. I was just going to share that when you're coming from communities that your history is very intentionally being erased, it's like all we can do to try to research, speak with our elders, find as much information as we can to preserve those histories. I think when my father passed in 2006, it was like almost like a grieving strategy for me to like collect every memory I could possible of the things that he shared with me. And I think it's a similar kind of grief when their communities facing, genocide, where one of the first things to be hit is, the cultural consciousness and shifting what the history was and shifting what the memories are, and then rewriting and creating revisionist histories and new memories, and literally erasing entire experiences and histories of different communities. So in these tiny poems, I absolutely take a lot of time to do as much research as I can, even if it's like little details, whether that's a flood in Hyderabad or, a tree that saved like 500 people's lives during that flood, or, just different details, or different things my father shared, and sort of our ancestors, live on through us remembering them. And that is how we can uplift them and keep them close to us. So it is something really important to me as a poet.
So I think whenever we write about violence, but especially all the more so when you're writing about these intergenerational stories of violence, there's always this notion of different sides, or it's very hard in at least like the English language to separate the person experiencing violence and whoever is acting on them, even if it's like an intrapersonal experience. And so, we have these notions, all of us, even just everybody with us, of these different sides in each conflict, whether it's something you're experiencing, in a moment with someone, or it's gone on over time. And I guess there's two questions I want to ask. The first one is, well, first, let me say, I guess, when we've got all of these sides, I think both in a piece of writing as well as in the world, there's sort of this question of, it's this microcosm of this question of where are you going to spend energy? Who gets grace and who gets space? Who gets to be attended to? Who gets attention? Who doesn't? Who gets silenced? Which stories are told? Which stories aren't? To whom? And so I wonder if you can both talk about if there's ongoing conflicts and violence that you are paying attention to in your writing, or just in your lives right now, because I know that was something that was kind of close to both of your hearts when we talked very briefly before this call. But also just how you and we can come back to this part later, but how you think about when you're crafting a piece, who gets to talk and who gets to take up space, and whose point of view is centered, and when do you engage multiple points of view? When is it important to kind of when does a piece come together through the juxtaposition of different points of view between generations, between sides, between anything? Dua, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can. So I would say personally in writing, and which is a separate question from what you mentioned about conflicts that are ongoing in the world. the work I'm doing right now professionally, I'm working for an organization that works on preventing genocide and mass atrocities. So in that way, professionally, all this is very close to my work and my life. And I don't think in any way we can or should ignore any of the conflicts happening around the world, particularly since many of them are happening to Muslim populations. Whether it's the Uyghur population, the Rohingya, or many of the ones, Kashmir, that Kazim mentioned earlier. In terms of writing, I think when I write, I try not to keep an audience in mind. And so for me, because that's sometimes just a little too much pressure. So I'm usually writing to figure out what I'm feeling and to contend with myself, to explain myself to myself. And so the histories here and the sides that you're talking about kind of play out in the background for me. And I think those elements are still very essential. And again, going back to the topic of research, they require work on how you're going to create that background. But I think I contend less with sides or whose story you're telling in that way and focus more on my relation to it, if that makes sense.
That's a good strategy, I think, for a lot of us when we're stuck. Sham-e-Ali, do you want to talk about some of the conflicts that kind of maybe set the stage for your piece, or the question about writing?
Could you repeat the question on writing again?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of threw a lot in there altogether. I was trying to give you a heads up of where I might go next, and I kind of tried to roll too much in there. The question about writing is just how do you think about letting different sides or perspectives play out um, in a piece? And those sides could be just like the fragments that make up a poem, and they could also be who, which characters, which points of view get to take up space.
I tend not to look at things in sides in terms of when I'm in the liminal space of creating a piece. I usually am guided from a place. I kind of see poetry as like a lens where we distill life. So yes, there's a multiplicity of different perspectives in such a lens. But oftentimes I'm writing from the lens of the emotional heart space, like kind of like a dream. It's kind of like saying, what are the sides in a dream? It's like in a dream, there are no sides. It's kind of what you feel like. You can have so much happen in just a really concentrated amount of time. And it's like a feeling within your heart and your body. Or it's a set of, I guess if I were to say different perspectives, I pick the perspectives of people I'm in close relationship with, or that I see in terms of just our human experience and as like a collective humans. And I think there are occasions when I definitely try not to write from someone else's. I try to be really careful that I'm not like taking someone else's story and like putting on my projections into somebody else's story. And so I tend to try to pick things that I feel some connection to, or that I see as a lens in terms of our shared experience as human beings. Yeah, so I hope that kind of hits what you were looking for.
Yes. Kazim, are you about to say something? Okay. Well, what I took away from both of your answers is that you center your own experience, and you feel really like get to take up space while you're writing, And I think that that's a really beautiful and wonderful thing to get to do as any writer, as a Muslim female identifying writer in particular in these days. And I think that that's probably a big part of what where the beauty in your writing and all of the little bits that we can connect to come from. Um, Maybe we can, just before we end, talk a little bit about the importance of joy in writing about grief and violence. So, Sham-e-Ali, I'm thinking, for example, in your piece, you read about walks by cattails and um, places where, you learned or love to learn, um, and chasing after these things. I especially love, like, the bits of joy that exist in these pieces, and also, I think that's so much of what can make writing about grief successful. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what bits of joy or what happiness for, yourself or your narrator or the people you're writing about, means, and or why it's important to you in your writing.
Well, one of the things about grief is it's so deeply linked to love. And we wouldn't grieve so deeply if we didn't love so deeply. And so embedded in love is joy. And so joy is so connected, even in our grieving. And I feel that it's really important for us to have those things that we can remember, that nourish us, that surround us despite anything happening in our lives. Whether that is the joy we can feel in our experience and relationship with land and nature, the joy that we can feel in our relationships with the people we hold dear and care about, and even the joy that we can feel in just the things that make us happy, so that even in like full calamity, there can be that ray of sunlight that falls warmly against the cheek that can still give you joy. And this is the way I at least see life, is that these things are happening all at once. Every time we have a sunrise, there is a simultaneous sunset happening at the exact same time. They're so linked to each other. So I do feel it's really important to bring in that aspect of its wholeness, by having the elements of joy, elements of nature, elements of nourishment, elements of peace. So yeah, thank you, Ayeh.
I think that was such a beautiful note for us to kind of end the conversation part of our talk on. Yeah, I think it's just so important to be able to, especially in a world where often as Muslims we're expected to write about hard things. It's so important to be able to, and it feels almost like revolutionary sometimes to be able to put out a piece that's about joy, or make sure that it's in there in a piece. So I think I'm just gonna see if Kazim and then Matthew want to close us out here. Thank you both for um, being with me and answering these questions. It's been a joy to get to know your writing. And thanks to everyone who showed up to kind of hear us read and to talk, and to Consequence for helping to make this happen.
Thank you. I'll just say very quickly, the notion of the conversation that you just invoked is precisely what we're hoping to have. It's what the book is. The book is a conversation, and it's an invitation to conversations, not only among the community of people who are included in it, but in the classrooms and communities that might read it together. And hopefully it will spark many future conversations. We're doing a series of events all month long. Ayeh is behind many of them, helping to organize and getting the word out about this anthology. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart too, for taking this anthology so much to heart. And Sham-e-Ali and I were at, so in other words, to go to the Red Hen page, redhenpress.org, and see the schedule of events. They're all there, the details, mostly Zoom events, so you can check out what's happening. But Sham-e-Ali and I were at an event, did an event Zoom-wise. Two of the contributors were live in person at a bookstore in New Mexico, and then we Zoomed in. And at the close of the event, one of the local people brought up an 11-year-old girl in the community named Nadia, who is a poet, and Nadia closed the reading. Nadia's not in the anthology, but she closed the reading with a reading of her own poetry. And so that's what, that is that's the greatest hope, is that, as you said, Ayeh, new writers will see this writings in this book and feel, I too can write, I too can tell my story. Nobody could ask for more than that.
Yeah, and I'll second a lot of what Kazim just said. The conversations that Consequence Forum hopes to engender we do specifically because of what has kind of happened here tonight. Just this an engagement with ideas that often aren't necessarily talked about or talked about with the variety of people that we have in the room here tonight. So on behalf of Consequence Forum, I'd like to thank Red Hen Press for helping to bring this event together, and Kazim, Ayeh, Sham-e-Ali, and Dua for a wonderful reading and a compelling discussion. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone who attended. As I was just saying, it's through events and discussions like these that we all get to engage with not only great art, as in this anthology, but with powerful ideas as well. And to that, if I can put a small plug in here for the writers here and for Red Hen Press, if you can, pick up the anthology and or some of the work from the authors you heard here tonight. So again, thank you everybody, and I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful night.